Hey guys, it's Miss Kelly, and we are going to be finishing out our lessons on Hansel and Gretel today. And we're going to take a look at first our learning target. So let's look at what we've done this week with the story of Hansel and Gretel. So our learning target says I can summarize stories to include important details, character traits, and comparisons between the two texts. And to get us going, we're going to look back over yesterday's activity that you did at home in your Write About Reading notebooks, which was comparing the two texts. And we did this with a comparison chart. And you really compared the story elements in the second version of Hansel and Gretel, which was Trust Me, Hansel and Gretel Are Sweet. And that is the story we read yesterday. So we're going to briefly look at my anchor chart, and you can compare it to yours. They may not be exact, but hopefully we all have the same gist of answers that you came up with at home. So yesterday I told you at the top is where you would put your titles. So we see that the first column is our first story, which was the traditional fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. And then the second story, which we read yesterday, Trust Me, Hansel and Gretel Are Sweet. So our characters in the first story, in the traditional story, you can see Hansel, Gretel, Mother, Father, and the little old lady. So those are our characters in that one. But when we looked at the characters in the second version, we can see a few changes. And I can see that we still have Hansel and Gretel, but this time the little old lady was referred to as the witch. So you'll notice I have witch on my anchor chart. Then there was thorn. And then we have stepmother and then the father. So differences, stepmother in that version, mother in this version, witch, little old lady, and then we had an added character which was thorn. So you can see some similarities and some differences with our characters. With our with our setting, I had that the setting in the first story was in the forest because they did spend the majority of time in the forest. And the majority of the time spent in the second story was at the witch's house. So, but if you added forest for both, that's fine as well because the house was in the forest. All right, so this is where some of our answers may differ a little bit, but hopefully we have the central idea for all of these. So the problem, Miss Kelly stated that Hansel and Gretel want to get home, but become trapped at the little old lady's home. So that was the overall problem. The overall problem in the second version was Thorn and the stepmother wanted the kids and the witch out of the picture so they could eat the house. So that was the problem in the second story. So solution, that's how our problem is solved. How did they get around this problem? In the first story, Gretel pushed the old lady into the oven and let Hansel out because remember he was trapped and they wanted to get home. So she let him out. And then in the second story, the witch got out of the oven and Thorn and stepmother were scared away because they couldn't believe she was still living after being in the oven. And they were never seen of again. And so how did they end? So in the first story, they took the jewels and they went home back to their family and they lived happily ever after. And then in the second version, Hansel and Gretel and the dad, they all lived happily in the witch's house. So those are some comparisons. You can pause this video, look at my anchor chart, re-listen to what I just said to check your answers, okay? Now, since it is Thursday and our last lesson for the week, we're going to look at vocabulary because I know most of you have vocabulary tests, and then we're going to review for your assessment that you will submit on Teams. So our vocabulary words this week, you can see them behind me as well. So the first one that we're going to look at is scarce. And think in your minds, what does scarce mean? That's right. When you have a scarce amount of something, it's a small amount. So we see there's nothing out there on that piece of land. It's scarce. Okay, our second word, and hopefully you've been practicing. Whoops, Skelly dropped it. Hopefully you've been practicing these at home. So we have anxious. And so when you're anxious, you're feeling afraid, you may be feeling nervous about what's getting ready to happen. And you can see he is looking very worried. Our third word was fetch. This one, again, like I've said before, was a review. So that one should be really easy for you, but it's when you go and get something and bring it back. We have devouring. When you devour something, you are eating it very, very quickly to show that you are very hungry. And then we have cauldron, and cauldron is a big pot. And then finally we have kneading, which shows someone preparing dough with their hands. So kneading. So those are your words. Make sure you've studied them and you take your vocabulary quiz on Teams. Now, let's do a quick review of what you might see on your comprehension check for Hansel and Gretel. Your comprehension check is going to be mostly about Hansel and Gretel. There are going to be some questions that you have to compare and contrast the two stories, but as you're answering these questions, I want you to think of the first story we read, which was the traditional story. And if you want to go back to day one and re-listen to me read this story, that might be a good idea. But this is where the majority of your answers are going to be coming from, okay? So the first thing that I want you to ponder is the setting in the story. And we've already talked about it by looking at our reading responses from yesterday. But where would you say the setting took place in the story? And I would say the forest too. So these children, the majority of our time was spent in the forest in this story. So forest is the setting, okay? Thinking of the little old lady in that story, when they first came up to her house and met her, how did she seem? How would you describe her? Would you say she was mean? Would you say she was shy? Or would you say she was nice? And think of when they first got there, what would you say? Yes, she was nice. And if you think of evidence from the text to support the way she was nice, she invited them in and fed them really, really well because she knew they were hungry. Fed them a good dinner. So that's definitely showing some nice characteristics. So at first she was nice. Now thinking of the ending of the story, what would you say, and you're drawing your own conclusions here, but what would you say was the most important thing that happened at the end of our story? And remember, we're thinking about this story. What would you say was the most important thing that happened? And many of us, yes, are going to say when Hansel pushed the old lady into the oven and her and Hansel were able to get away. A lot of us are going to say that, and I think that's a very good response to support that question. Now, when you think of the word clever, a synonym for clever is smart. So when somebody is clever, they make good decisions and they're using their minds. Thinking of Hansel and Gretel, what are some ways that Hansel and Gretel were clever in the story? Think about that for a few seconds. Clever, how were they clever? So I have several details that come to mind from that story. One of the first that come to mind is when Hansel used the pebbles to show how to get back home. That was clever because he knew those pebbles would glisten in the moonlight and he would be able to follow that path home. So that was clever. That would be my first idea. Another example of them being clever would be when he was trapped and the old lady was trying to fatten him up and he knew that. So instead of sticking his finger out, he stuck out a bone so she wouldn't think he was getting fat. So I think that's clever. That's using your mind. That's using your brains. And then the third idea that I came up with from the text is when Gretel tricked the little old lady into the little old lady showing her how to see if the oven was ready. And that way she was able to push the little old lady in the oven instead. So those are some examples of ways that they were clever. You may think of a few more, and that's totally okay. But thinking about that, you will have to tell me some ideas, some details on the ways that you think that they were clever. And then I want you to also think of a lesson you can learn from Hansel and Gretel. There's a couple of things that you might have drawn a conclusion about of what Hansel and Gretel probably learned from all of this. So I want you to be thinking about that. And then the last couple of things that you're going to have to do is where you're going to compare and contrast both versions. So we have this story and we have this story, okay? And I want you to tell me one difference in both of the stories and then one similarity, okay? So let's think of a difference right now just to give you an example. A difference in the first story is she was referred to as the little old lady, and then in this story she was referred to as the witch. And then an example of something that they have in common could be that, let's see, that Hansel and Gretel were the main characters in both stories. That's a really, really easy one. You could also say that they lived happily ever after. You could say that the oven was a major part at the end of the end of both stories. I would say it was an important part in both versions of the story. There's so many different things you could say. Okay? So as always, if you need to go back and listen to either one of these stories again, do that. Okay? I have enjoyed reading Hansel and Gretel with you this week, and on Miss Kelly's teams, I posed a question to you to tell me which version you think is the most believable, because I normally ask you that at school. So respond to me. Tell me which one you think is the most believable. Okay? All right, guys. Enjoy your spring break, and I look forward to seeing you and listening or in reading and listening to your answers after spring break. Okay? Bye.